next speaker. He joins me now in the studio. Neil James, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Language, it is really all about language, and if we look at last night's Bronco Leagues Club, for example, you saw a real change in the language there, didn't you, from both leaders?
Look, there's been a significant change. Up until the last couple of weeks, I've been dubbing this the campaign of the ventriloquist dummies, because both leaders have stayed on a very careful script, probably driven by their focus group research. So in Julia Gillard's case, it was all about moving forward to have a conversation with the Australian people so that we can work together and put the country back on track.
All you need is the accent and you have it right.
Series of cliches that don't mean terribly much. In Tony Abbott's case, it was a kind of an attack language. End the waste, stop the boats, that Kevin Rudd was executed by the warlords, Work Choices is dead, buried and cremated. And they both overused that kind of script. And I think what we've seen in the last few days, and certainly in the community forums, is that they've started to drop that language. We had the very extraordinary admission, really, partway through the campaign from the Labor side, that it was time that they needed to unleash the real Julia. And I think that was an admission that they probably got the balance wrong, that probably they overused the script and the messages, and it was dominating too much, and people weren't taking it in. They weren't. They were hearing it, they were being annoyed by it, and it wasn't coming across as being all that sincere.
Well, that certainly explains, I mean, the moving forward, we've hardly heard it all, really, since the real Julia has been out and about. But at the same time, you are getting similar responses to similar questions. The coalition mantra of stopping the boats, paying back the debt, and so on, we still hear that. Is this a case of just repeat until we're all so sick of it that we actually remember it?
Yeah, that's partly the strategy, and of course it's the same strategy that advertisers use. We'd all be aware of a television ad or a radio ad that we hate because it has that jingle that stays in the mind, but the message stays in there, and that's why they use it.
But isn't it a fine line? I mean, so many people say, I'm so sick of hearing that. So at what point does it stay in the mind and sticks with you, and then tips over the edge to, I am so annoyed by that, I'm going to respond against it?
And I think they did tip over that point. I think for many people, because it was just so obviously contrived and so obviously scripted by the party bosses and the research, that it wasn't sincere. Really, a good political leader needs to, certainly you've got to have your campaign messages, you've got to be able to get those out, but you also need to be your personality. You've got to blend that with who you are and sound genuine and sound sincere. And I think in the early part of the campaign, both of them really lost that balance. And so it would have turned a lot of people off. And I think the two community forums, it's very interesting that both sides chose that particular format instead of other debates.
So give me an example of the sorts of language that you see as helping people sound sincere, because you might go back to for example, Julia Gillard's campaign launch. She used friends. I don't know how many times it's been made fun of on Yes We Canberra and that sort of thing, but to me it almost, well, it overdid the friends thing. I mean, what sort of language has been used, do you think, successfully to communicate?
Yeah, it's hard, unlike the sort of on-message phrases, it's hard to point to particular words because they've been reverting more to their own natural speech. So in Tony Abbott's case, he does tend to use idiom a bit more. So he does tend to use phrases partly drawn from his background, often biblical phrases, things like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Last night we heard a bit about there's no magic wand. We had a magic wand several times, or no magic bullet. So he falls back on some of that kind of language. Julia Gillard's case last night was very much playing to the audience. You may have noticed that before she answered most questions, she often thanked the questioner, or then made some Queensland reference, or would start with "I understand the point of view" if it was a question that was more hostile. So, as an attempt to really engage in that more conversive style, rather than hammer home, even when she was asked about Kevin Rudd, I mean, she almost was at pains to avoid saying the phrases "back on track" and "lost its way," which were, of course, the two big message phrases. So it's not so much about the words they use, but the words they have been avoiding in recent days.
So you'd say, just to summarise, that eventually we've got the language perhaps we've seen in previous campaigns. It took a while, but at least finally we seem to be hearing from the leaders themselves.
Yes, the depressing thing is that it took so long. Maybe there's an element of this that comes from the fact that they're both reasonably new in the job, in the top job, and they hadn't yet sort of found their voice. But if we'd started with the sort of language of the community forums in the earlier part of the campaign, I think people would have tuned in a lot more. Whereas very early on, with all of that over-scripted, controlled language, I think it turned a lot of people off.
Well, only 2 days to go now. Dr. Neil James, many thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Dr. James there from the Plain English Foundation.